Have you ever found yourself wondering why people willingly, even enthusiastically, cheer for leaders they know are corrupt? Why the same public that demands justice can turn right around and idolize someone who openly breaks the rules? It's more than just a political head scratcher, isn't it? It's a psychological warning sign. And if we're honest, it's one that says more about us than the leaders we choose. Take former Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak, accused of embezzling a staggering $4.5 billion from the state fund. Despite what seemed like overwhelming evidence, his supporters defended him, calling him a patriot who put national development over so-called Western-style accountability. Or think back to Italy, where millions poured into the streets, chanting Mussolini's name, even as he dismantled democratic principles and centralized his power. We've seen this play out across continents and throughout history. Leaders who don't just hide their corruption, but almost flaunt it and are celebrated for it. And this isn't just some dusty old history lesson. Researchers from Harvard and the University of Chicago, looking into voter behavior in places where politicians with criminal records consistently win, made a pretty startling discovery. A full 40% of voters knowingly backed corrupt candidates. And their justification? It often sounds something like this. Sometimes you need someone willing to break the rules, someone who gets things done when others can't.
Welcome to Channel. Today, we're diving deep into Friedrich Nietzsche's often controversial insights into this very human, very unsettling psychological phenomenon. And believe me, this isn't just about politics. These same undercurrents can explain everything from the toxic relationships we get entangled in to the dynamics of cult followings. It touches on our celebrity obsessions and even why some business titans seem to face no real consequences for their actions. Have you ever caught yourself, even for a moment, admiring someone despite knowing they've crossed serious ethical lines? Or just wondered why, as societies, we repeatedly seem to elevate leaders with some pretty obvious character flaws? Stick with me, because by the end of this, I think you'll start recognizing these patterns in your own decision-making and begin to grasp what Nietzsche understood about human nature, something many of us, perhaps, still find a little uncomfortable to admit.
Picture yourself standing at the edge of a vast precipice. Below you, there's just the unknown, chaotic, unpredictable, maybe even a bit threatening. According to Nietzsche, this isn't just a dramatic landscape. It's a pretty good metaphor for the fundamental human condition. We find ourselves in a universe with no inherent meaning or prepackaged structure, facing uncertainty at almost every turn. So, how do we respond to that? Nietzsche's powerful insight here was what he termed the will to power. Now, this isn't simply about dominating others. It's a deeper drive towards mastery over existence itself. As he put it, my idea is that every specific body strives to become master over all space and to extend its force, its will to power, he wrote. This isn't some abstract philosophical fluff. It's incredibly practical psychology. Think about it. Humans don't primarily seek happiness or pleasure. What we often crave more is a sense of control. We desperately want to feel that we understand our world and that we can navigate it effectively.
So, when that feeling of personal control seems impossible, maybe during economic turmoil, social upheaval, or even deep personal failure, we can become surprisingly susceptible to anyone who offers us a taste, even a vicarious one, of their apparent power. Just look at modern political rallies, thousands chanting a leader's name, often fully aware of their ethical transgressions. These supporters aren't necessarily ignorant. They're tapping into a sense of vicarious power, feeling stronger by associating with someone who appears to master the chaos they feel.
Social psychologist Jennifer Whitson uncovered something truly fascinating about this. In a 2008 study, she found that participants who were made to feel deprived of control were 40% more likely to see illusory patterns where there were none, and to endorse conspiracy theories. And, in a similar vein, they tend to gravitate towards leaders who project absolute certainty, even if that certainty requires some serious ethical compromises. When was the last time you, perhaps grudgingly, admired someone for getting results using methods you'd personally consider, well, wrong?
This kind of contradiction, if we spot it in ourselves, can reveal something pretty profound about our complicated relationship with power. Especially during uncertain times, our ethical goalposts can shift without us even consciously realizing it. Nietzsche put it starkly in The Antichrist. What is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. This provocative statement is key to his controversial theory of moral psychology.
You see, Nietzsche identified two competing moral frameworks that he believed weave throughout human history. First, there's master morality. This framework values strength, achievement, dominance, and all around excellence. It defines good as whatever demonstrates power, and bad as anything that reveals weakness. Then there's slave morality, which Nietzsche thought emerged among oppressed peoples. This one prizes humility, empathy, equality, and compassion. It tends to label the powerful as evil and the humble as good. Now, modern democratic societies, at least on the surface, tend to officially embrace slave morality. We publicly champion equality, compassion, and fairness. Yet, just beneath this consensus, there's a fascinating, often unspoken, tension. Many people, perhaps more than we'd like to admit, secretly admire raw, unapologetic displays of power. They might condemn exploitation from Monday to Friday, but then they'll binge watch a show like Succession on the weekends, getting a secret thrill from the ruthless corporate maneuvering. It's a fascinating disconnect, isn't it? This isn't just simple hypocrisy. It points to a deeper psychological reality that profoundly shapes how we relate to leadership.
Think about Napoleon Bonaparte. The man was responsible for wars that killed millions, yet he inspired incredible devotion, not in spite of his conquests, but often because of them. His admirers weren't saying, "Oh, he's a good man despite his flaws." They were saying something more like, "He's a man of destiny, someone who transcends ordinary moral boundaries." A 2019 study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology actually confirmed this kind of contradiction. Researchers found that participants who claimed to value equality still, fascinatingly, rated dominant, power-seeking individuals as more charismatic and effective leaders. We tell pollsters we want ethical leaders, but our actual behavior often ends up rewarding those bold displays of dominance.
So, how do you react when someone successfully breaks rules that seem to constrain everyone else? Do you feel pure outrage? Or is there sometimes, just sometimes, a little twinge of admiration? When supporters defend a corrupt leader's actions by saying, well, at least they're strong, they're not necessarily making a logical error from their internal standpoint. They're actually revealing those master morality values that can operate just beneath our consciously held egalitarian principles. Perhaps Nietzsche's most illuminating concept for understanding today's political landscape is what he called ressentiment. This French term is more than just simple resentment. It's a kind of festering psychological condition born from a perceived lack of power, suppressed feelings of vengeance, and rage that's been redirected. Man would rather will nothingness than not will at all, Nietzsche wrote. Or to put it another way, if we feel completely powerless, sometimes any action, even destructive action, can feel better than doing nothing at all. This helps explain why people sometimes throw their support behind leaders who seem intent on tearing down institutions, rather than continuing to feel like they have no influence whatsoever.
Imagine a community absolutely devastated by factory closures and a long economic decline. For years, residents have watched their town deteriorate, feeling utterly ignored by mainstream institutions. Then, a charismatic figure arrives on the scene. This person does something no one else has. They acknowledge the community's suffering and, crucially, promise retribution against those they frame as responsible. Even if this figure engages in corrupt practices themselves, they often gain fervent, unwavering support. Why? Because in that moment, addressing abstract corruption often takes a backseat to the immense psychological relief of finally having one's pain seen, recognized, and perhaps avenged. When people feel their core values are being undermined, their economic security is threatened, or their social status is diminished, they don't just want solutions, they often crave vindication. Political scientist Catherine Kramer's field research in Wisconsin showed exactly this. She found rural residents supporting policies that sometimes even worked against their own economic interests, primarily because those policies were seen as punishing the urban elites whom they blamed for their marginalization. The emotional payoff of seeing perceived enemies suffer outweighed for them the material concerns. This helps us understand why struggling communities sometimes rally behind leaders who objectively might be damaging their material interests. These communities aren't necessarily miscalculating, they're making a choice for emotional vindication over purely practical benefit. Be honest with yourself on this one. Have you ever supported someone not so much because they helped you, but because they seemed to hurt someone you felt had wronged you? This impulse, which we all share to varying degrees, becomes particularly dangerous when it's skillfully manipulated by corrupt leadership.
Freedom is the will to be responsible for ourselves, wrote Nietzsche. A simple statement, but it contains a profound insight. True freedom, the kind Nietzsche is talking about, carries with it the heavy, sometimes daunting burden of responsibility. When we make our own moral choices, we can no longer easily blame others for the outcomes. In his work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche describes three spiritual transformations humans can undergo. First, there's the camel, dutifully carrying burdens imposed by others. Next comes the lion, fighting for freedom from those burdens. But it's only the third stage, the child, who can truly create new values and new meaning.
Most people, Nietzsche rather starkly observed, remain camels throughout their lives, preferring the familiar weight of external authority to the terrifying, exhilarating freedom of forging their own meaning. The psychologist Erich Fromm later expanded on this in his book, Escape from Freedom. He argued that the sheer anxiety of moral responsibility can drive people towards authoritarian systems precisely because those systems offer to relieve them of the burdensome weight of decision-making.
Think about facing a really complex ethical dilemma, one with no clear right answer. What feels more comfortable? Making the tough decision yourself and bearing all the responsibility for whatever happens, or having a strong, confident authority figure simply tell you what to do? And for many of us, if we're truly honest, the latter option brings a profound sense of relief. This psychological mechanism helps explain why corrupt but decisive leaders often gain support, especially during times of great complexity and uncertainty. When a charismatic figure confidently proclaims, "I alone can fix it," or "the solution is simple, trust me," they're offering a kind of liberation from the existential burden of us having to figure it all out ourselves. During Germany's chaotic Weimar period, for instance, many citizens embraced leadership that offered clear narratives and decisive action, despite mounting evidence of corruption. The psychological relief of not having to navigate that moral complexity themselves often outweighed their concerns about integrity. So, ask yourself, when was the last time you perhaps deferred a difficult moral choice to an authority figure? That comfort you might have felt, that relief of not having to decide for yourself, connects directly to how entire societies can sometimes embrace corrupt but seemingly decisive leaders.
The surest way to corrupt a youth, Nietzsche observed, is to instruct him to hold in higher esteem those who think alike than those who think differently. This observation from his work, The Dawn, really captures a fundamental aspect of our human psychology, our deeply, deeply social nature. Humans evolved as tribal creatures. Our ancestors survived not primarily through individual strength, but through group cohesion. This evolutionary heritage has left us with an instinctive drive to seek safety in collective identity and consensus, what Nietzsche called the herd instinct. Now, this instinct serves many positive functions, of course. It enables cooperation, helps build communities, and creates shared meaning. But it can become dangerous when a corrupt leader successfully positions themselves as the authentic voice or the sole protector of the group. When this happens, our powerful instinct for conformity can actually override our individual moral judgment. The psychological cost of standing apart from our social group, of being an outsider, often feels far greater than the cost of compromising our personal ethics. We see this dynamic play out so clearly in how whistleblowers are often treated, even when they expose undeniable wrongdoing.
Consider the Enron scandal. When Sharon Watkins courageously warned CEO Kenneth Lay about the massive accounting irregularities, she wasn't hailed as a hero, at least not initially. Instead, she was marginalized and even faced career threats, despite being proven entirely right in the end. Our social programming runs so deep that we often instinctively punish those who challenge group cohesion, even when they're objectively in the right. And the power of this herd instinct only intensifies when corrupt leaders deliberately stoke tribal identity, skillfully framing any criticism of them as an attack on the group itself. They manage to transform accountability into an act of betrayal. The social cost of breaking from the group becomes so incredibly high that many people will find themselves defending increasingly corrupt behavior rather than face the pain of exclusion. Social psychologist Jonathan Haidt observed this dynamic powerfully in his research. He noted that when our sacred values are threatened, we tend to become intuitive theologians rather than intuitive scientists, passionately defending our group's beliefs regardless of the evidence. Where in your own life have you felt that pressure to support something you privately questioned, simply to maintain that vital sense of group belonging? This constant tension between our social nature and our individual moral compass profoundly shapes our relationship with all forms of leadership. God is dead, proclaimed Nietzsche's madman in The Gay Science. With this now famous declaration, Nietzsche wasn't just making a statement about religious skepticism, he was announcing a profound psychological crisis for humanity. If there's no divine authority, then who or what provides meaning and moral guidance? Despite the decline of traditional religion in many societies, Nietzsche keenly observed that our deep psychological need for something to worship, something to look up to, remains largely unchanged. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he offered a warning that still resonates powerfully today. Beware that a statue does not crush you.
We can see this hero worship impulse everywhere in our culture, can't we? Listen to how we talk about certain leaders or innovators. She's playing 4D chess. He just sees around corners. They're always 10 steps ahead of everyone else. These aren't really descriptions of capable human beings, they're echoes of modern myth-making. A corrupt leader who truly understands this psychology doesn't just present themselves as merely competent. Oh no, they cultivate an aura of exceptionalism, of almost being touched by destiny. And then their corruption gets reframed. It's not a character flaw anymore, but somehow becomes evidence of their extraordinary nature. Normal rules don't apply to great men and women, the narrative goes. History is made by those willing to break conventions. Take Vladimir Putin, for example. Despite widespread reports of corruption and immense personal wealth, many of his supporters reframe these very things as signs of strength, as necessary components for Russia's resurgence on the world stage. His lavish lifestyle isn't seen by them as mere greed, but almost as a symbol of national pride. By skillfully linking his personal power to potent patriotic narratives, Putin manages to turn what might otherwise be widely condemned into something that some Russians will vigorously defend as part of their national identity. The cultivation of a cult of personality isn't just about vanity, it's incredibly strategic psychology. When we elevate leaders to heroic or even quasi-religious status, we become deeply invested in defending their mythic image rather than objectively evaluating their actual behavior.
Psychologist Dan McAdams discovered something remarkable in his research on this. He found that supporters of controversial leaders often integrate their own personal identity with the narratives surrounding the leader's perceived greatness. Think how deep that goes. For them, abandoning the leader would require a painful reconstruction of their own sense of self, making any criticism feel almost like a personal betrayal. Do you have heroes whose flaws you find yourself consistently defending or perhaps minimizing? Our need for idealized figures is profoundly human, but it's also a significant vulnerability that corrupt leaders are all too ready to exploit.
In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche introduces two powerful opposing human archetypes that really illuminate our relationship with leadership. The Übermensch, often translated as Superman or Overman, and the Last Man. The Übermensch represents Nietzsche's ideal, someone who courageously creates their own values, embraces life's challenges head-on, and takes full responsibility for their choices. The Last Man, by stark contrast, seeks only comfort, security, and the complete absence of difficulty.
They have left the regions where it was hard to live, for one needs warmth, Nietzsche writes. One still loves one's neighbor and rubs against him, for one needs warmth. This vivid, almost uncomfortable description helps explain another paradox of leadership. We often find ourselves supporting leaders who promise to protect us from life's hardships and complexities. This is particularly dangerous when we're trying to distinguish between populist leaders who might be addressing genuine grievances and corrupt leaders who are merely exploiting those same grievances for their own ends. The FIFA corruption scandal offers a perfect, if perhaps mundane, example. Many football fans around the world knew FIFA officials were corrupt, but they supported them anyway. Why? Because those officials delivered what the fans ultimately wanted: exciting tournaments and a sense of national pride, all without demanding any difficult or uncomfortable changes to the sport's economics or governance. Imagine two political speeches. One leader says, "The challenges we face are incredibly complex, and overcoming them will require difficult choices and real sacrifices from all of us." The other proclaims, "The problems are simple, folks, and I alone can fix them without any sacrifice from you." Which one consistently wins elections across cultures and time periods? The evidence, unfortunately, is pretty clear. Political scientists studying voter behavior have found something quite revealing. During periods of economic or social stress, voters consistently gravitate toward leaders who offer simple solutions and convenient scapegoats, rather than those who acknowledge the messy complexity of the situation.
And here's the kicker. Even when deep down they might know the simple solutions are unlikely to work, the psychological comfort offered often outweighs purely practical considerations. What comforts do you seek from leadership? What complexities are you sometimes tempted to avoid? In recognizing our own desire for those easy answers, we begin to understand our own vulnerability to those who would exploit this very human desire. But the psychological patterns we've explored here aren't some inevitable destiny. Some societies have actually recognized these vulnerabilities and have developed pretty effective immunities against corrupt leadership. Consider post-apartheid South Africa under Nelson Mandela. Despite incredibly strong incentives for vengeance and exploitation after decades of brutal oppression, the very conditions that typically fuel support for corrupt, authoritarian leadership, South Africa chose a different, much harder path. Mandela's Truth and Reconciliation Commission deliberately channeled the powerful feelings of resentment towards healing and understanding rather than retribution. By acknowledging people's profound pain while simultaneously rejecting vengeance as a solution, South Africa created a powerful model for transcending the kind of psychology that so often enables corruption.
Iceland's response to the 2008 financial crisis offers another inspiring example. When corrupt bankers and politicians threatened their entire economy, ordinary citizens launched what became known as the kitchenware revolution, literally surrounding parliament, banging pots and pans. They forced resignations, they jailed banking executives, and they even rewrote their constitution through direct citizen involvement. Iceland succeeded by cultivating a sense of collective efficacy that shared, empowering belief that citizens, working together, can reshape their circumstances. This directly counteracts the psychological helplessness that so often drives support for corrupt strongmen. At the individual level, resistance really begins with self-awareness. Ask yourself, am I supporting a particular leader because they genuinely deliver practical benefits for me or my community? Or is it because they satisfy deeper, often unacknowledged, psychological cravings? For vengeance, for simplicity, or perhaps for tribal belonging?
The women of Liberia's Gibapolu County offer yet another powerful example. After enduring corrupt leadership that skillfully exploited tribal divisions, women from different ethnic groups came together to form cross-tribal councils. These councils created entirely new systems of accountability. By deliberately building relationships across those old group boundaries, they effectively neutralized the tribal psychology that corrupt leaders had so successfully manipulated. These examples all share a common thread, don't they? They don't try to deny the powerful psychological forces Nietzsche identified. Instead, they acknowledge these human vulnerabilities and then work to build structures that can channel those forces toward healthier, more constructive expressions. The drive for power can become democratic participation. The need for heroes can shift towards celebrating everyday citizens performing small but significant acts of integrity. Have you noticed how your own community either reinforces these dangerous patterns or actively resists them? Our vulnerability to corrupt leadership isn't some personal failing, it's a deeply human trait. Our strength, then, comes from creating communities that help us transcend these tendencies together. Nietzsche didn't just expose our psychological vulnerabilities, he also offered a path to rise above them. Become who you are, he wrote, urging us to strive for authentic self-development rather than simply being shaped by the will of others. To do that, though, we first have to understand the forces operating within us, our will to power, our resentment, our sometimes paralyzing fear of freedom, our herd instinct, our deep craving for idols, and that seductive longing for the comfort of the last man. These aren't just abstract philosophical ideas, they are the very impulses that corrupt leaders so expertly exploit.
Nietzsche challenges us to embrace amor fati, a love of one's fate. Instead of constantly seeking leaders who promise to rescue us from hardship, he calls on us to confront life's difficulties directly and, crucially, to create our own values, not just borrow them from some external authority. But this path, let's be clear, demands unflinching honesty. Why do we truly support the leaders we do? Is it based on reasoned judgment and a clear assessment of facts? Or is it because they satisfy those deeper emotional needs? For a feeling of strength? For simplicity in a complex world? For a sense of belonging? Or even, sometimes, for revenge? These are not easy questions. They can threaten our cherished self-image as purely rational, independent thinkers. But Nietzsche believed we could face them, and in doing so, transform ourselves, not by denying our instincts, but by understanding them, integrating them, and ultimately transcending their purely reactive forms. That, for him, is how we evolve. Man is something that shall be overcome, he wrote. And maybe, just maybe, understanding why we sometimes worship corrupt leaders is the very first essential step in that great overcoming. If this exploration has sparked something in you, please don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone whose mind you respect, someone you can have a real conversation with. The discussions that follow might just help all of us become a little more conscious about who we choose to follow and why. And before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Which of these psychological forces do you see playing out most clearly, either in yourself or in society around you? Leave a comment below. Let's continue this conversation, not just to understand the world a little better, but perhaps to change how we live in it. Until next time, remember, the most dangerous power we can ever give any leader is the power to remain unquestioned.